March 15, 1944. The lagoon at Ulithi Atoll stretched turquoise and impossibly vast beneath the equatorial sun. Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Nakamura stood on the bridge of his damaged destroyer, watching through salt-stained binoculars as the American fleet assembled in waters that, 18 months earlier, had been as secure as Tokyo Bay itself. The sight defied comprehension. Hundreds of ships, carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, cargo vessels, tankers, repair ships, filled the anchorage in ordered rows that extended beyond the horizon. The lagoon that Japanese charts had marked as a minor atoll, strategically irrelevant and far from major shipping lanes, had become something Nakamura's training had never prepared him to witness: a mobile naval base larger than any permanent installation in the Japanese Empire. The sound reached him across the water, the industrial symphony of a fleet at work. Welding torches sparked on damaged hulls. Cranes swung supplies from cargo ships to carriers. Landing craft shuttled between vessels like worker bees servicing a hive. The smell of diesel fuel and hot metal drifted on the breeze. Nakamura lowered his binoculars and wiped sweat from his face with a hand that trembled slightly. He had been captured 3 days earlier when his destroyer, crippled by American aircraft, had been boarded by a landing party. Now he was being transferred to a prisoner transport, but before that journey began, his captors had brought him here, to Ulithi, to see what he would report when the war ended, if the war ended, if Japan survived what was coming. An American officer stood beside him, a young lieutenant whose Japanese was adequate for basic communication. The American gestured at the assembled fleet with something that might have been pride or might have been simple statement of fact. The Pacific Ocean, he said, was no longer a barrier, it was a highway, and America was driving it all the way to Tokyo. Nakamura said nothing. What could he say? The evidence floated before him in steel and paint, in the casual efficiency of a logistics operation that treated thousands of miles of ocean as a minor inconvenience rather than an impassable moat. He thought of the Imperial Navy's pre-war assessments, of the confident predictions that American forces would never project power across the vast Pacific, that the tyranny of distance would protect Japan's conquests, that the ocean itself would be Japan's greatest ally. The ocean had betrayed them, or rather, the Americans had refused to be limited by it. The story of how the Pacific transformed from Japan's defensive moat into America's highway of conquest begins not with battles, but with concepts, with fundamentally different understandings of distance, logistics, and what naval power meant in the age of modern warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its strategy on the assumption that the Pacific Ocean's vastness would exhaust any American attempt to strike across it. Japanese war planning calculated that American supply lines, stretching from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, would be impossibly long, vulnerable to interdiction, unsustainable over time. The distance itself would defeat American power projection. This was not unreasonable thinking in 1941. Naval warfare had traditionally been constrained by the range of coal bunkers and supply depots. Fleets operated from fixed bases, venturing out for campaigns, but always tethered to ports for resupply and repair. The British Royal Navy, the dominant naval power for centuries, had maintained its global reach through a network of colonial ports and coaling stations: Gibraltar, Malta, Aden, Singapore, Hong Kong. Naval power meant controlling these fixed points. The Japanese had studied this model and adapted it. Their conquests in 1941 and 1942 were designed to create a defensive perimeter anchored by island bases, Rabaul, Truk, Saipan, Wake, that would allow Japanese naval forces to operate while denying those same bases to American forces. The Americans, forced to operate from distant Hawaii or even more distant California, would find the logistics impossible. Their fleet would arrive exhausted, low on fuel, unable to sustain operations. The Pacific would do half of Japan's defensive work simply by existing. What Japanese planners failed to anticipate was that America would solve the tyranny of distance not by accepting it, but by engineering around it. The solution was not new bases, though America would build those too, but a revolution in mobile logistics that made bases unnecessary. The Americans would bring their bases with them. The concept was called the fleet train, and it represented a transformation in how naval power could be projected across oceanic distances. Instead of relying on fixed ports for resupply, the U.S. Navy developed a massive logistics fleet capable of replenishing combat ships at sea. Oilers could refuel destroyers and carriers without entering port. Ammunition ships could transfer shells and bombs while underway. Refrigerated cargo vessels carried fresh food. Repair ships brought mobile dry docks and machine shops. Hospital ships treated casualties. Destroyer tenders, submarine tenders, seaplane tenders provided maintenance and spare parts. The numbers tell the story of an industrial nation applying mass production to maritime logistics. By 1945, the U.S. Navy operated more than 1,400 auxiliary ships in the Pacific. Tankers, cargo vessels, repair ships, hospital ships, and specialized support craft. These vessels, unglamorous and often ignored in popular accounts of the war, were the key to American victory. They allowed the fleet to operate thousands of miles from the nearest American port for months at a time, to sustain combat operations on a scale that Japanese logistics could not match. The Japanese had expected that American carriers, after striking at Japanese positions, would need to withdraw to Pearl Harbor to rearm and replenish. The mathematics of distance made this seem inevitable. But when American task forces struck the Marshall Islands in early 1944, they did not retreat to Hawaii afterward. They refueled at sea from mobile tankers. They rearmed from ammunition ships. They remained on station, striking again and again, maintained by a logistics train that traveled with them. The ocean had not defeated American logistics. American logistics had conquered the ocean. At the center of this transformation was a piece of technology so mundane that its strategic importance was easy to overlook: the underway replenishment rig, a system of cables, hoses, and pumps that allowed ships to transfer fuel and supplies while both vessels were in motion. The process required skill and precision. Two ships, a tanker and a warship, would steam parallel courses 50 to 100 feet apart, maintaining precise speed and spacing, while heavy hoses connected them and pumped thousands of gallons of fuel oil across the gap. In heavy seas, in darkness, with enemy submarines potentially nearby, this delicate dance had to be performed perfectly or not at all. American crews practiced until the maneuver became routine. Oilers like the USS Cimarron could refuel multiple ships in a single day, pumping fuel continuously while the fleet steamed westward. The hose connecting tanker to destroyer became a symbol of American logistical supremacy, a physical manifestation of industrial capability applied to the problem of distance. Each gallon of fuel transferred at sea was a gallon that did not require a return to port, a day saved, a mile gained toward Tokyo. The Japanese watched this with growing alarm. Intelligence reports described American fleets that never seemed to need ports, that operated continuously without withdrawing to friendly waters. Japanese submarines, hunting American supply lines, found not vulnerable cargo ships limping toward fixed ports, but well-defended logistics groups that steamed in formation with combat vessels. Attempts to interdict these supply operations met fierce resistance from destroyer escorts and aircraft. The Americans had not simply protected their logistics, they had militarized logistics itself, making the supply chain part of the combat fleet. The contrast with Japanese logistics operations was stark. The Imperial Navy had tankers and supply ships, but they operated on traditional models, shuttling between fixed bases, delivering supplies to ports where combat ships would replenish. This system required secure bases, which required defensive forces, which required their own supplies. As American forces advanced across the Pacific, capturing or bypassing Japanese bases, the logistics network began to collapse. Rabaul, once a major supply hub, was isolated and rendered irrelevant. Truk, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was devastated by airstrikes and abandoned. Each lost base meant one less link in a supply chain that could not adapt to mobile warfare. By mid-1944, the transformation was complete. American task forces roamed the Pacific with a freedom of movement that made a mockery of Japanese defensive planning. They struck the Marianas, supported amphibious landings, defeated the Japanese fleet at the Philippine Sea, and did all of this without once returning to Pearl Harbor. The fleet train kept them supplied, the floating bases kept them operational. The ocean that was supposed to protect Japan had become a highway for American power projection. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had warned before Pearl Harbor that America's industrial capacity would prove decisive in a long war, had understood this conceptually, but even Yamamoto might have been surprised by how thoroughly the Americans militarized logistics. The fleet train was not merely supplying ships, it was enabling a new form of naval warfare where the ocean itself ceased to be an obstacle. Distance had been engineered into irrelevance. The evidence accumulated in Japanese military archives tells the story of this realization. A planning document from the Naval General Staff, dated July 1944, analyzed American operational patterns. The conclusion was bleak. Enemy forces demonstrate the ability to sustain combat operations indefinitely at distances previously thought to impose automatic withdrawal. Their logistics capabilities exceed our estimates by factors of 3 to 5. Defensive planning based on assumptions of limited American operational radius must be revised. But by July 1944, there was no time for revision. The American highway across the Pacific was already carrying invasion forces toward the Philippines. For the Japanese sailors and soldiers stationed on Pacific islands, the transformation of the ocean from barrier to highway meant something visceral and terrifying. They watched American convoys arrive with the inevitability of tides, first the combat ships, then the transports, then the endless stream of supply vessels that turned beachheads into bases and bases into staging areas for the next leap westward. The supplies that came ashore from those vessels spoke of abundance that bordered on the absurd from the Japanese perspective. On Saipan, after the island's capture in June 1944, Japanese prisoners examined American supply dumps with disbelief. Mountains of ammunition, warehouses full of rations, field hospitals with equipment Japanese doctors could only dream of, freshwater purification units, portable power generators, entire prefabricated buildings designed to be assembled on captured territory. The contrast with Japanese supply levels, always marginal, frequently inadequate, could not have been more clear. This was not merely superior logistics, this was a completely different conception of what military operations required. The fuel hose, that humble connector between tanker and warship, appeared again and again in Japanese after-action reports as a symbol of what they faced. Reconnaissance aircraft photographing American task forces invariably noted the refueling operations, destroyers alongside oilers, the characteristic spacing of ships engaged in underway replenishment. Japanese pilots learned to recognize these moments as opportunities for attack when American ships were vulnerable, but they also recognized them as demonstrations of capability.
An enemy that could refuel at sea was an enemy unbound by geography. One captured Japanese naval officer, interrogated aboard an American ship in late 1944, asked his questioner how many tankers the Pacific Fleet operated. When given an approximate number, several hundred, he fell silent for a long moment. Then he said, through the interpreter, that Japan had perhaps 40 tankers available for fleet operations, and most of those were being sunk by American submarines. The mathematics of fuel supply alone, he realized, made sustained operations impossible for Japan, while routine for America. The ocean was the same size for both sides, but only one side had the tools to cross it freely. The transformation in Japanese military thinking came slowly, resisted by commanders who could not accept that their defensive perimeter had become irrelevant. But by 1945, the evidence was inescapable. American fleets operated in waters that Japanese planning had designated as securely controlled. Carriers struck the home islands themselves, launching aircraft that bombed Japanese cities from positions in the Pacific that should have been beyond operational range. The immunity that distance was supposed to provide evaporated.
In the final year of the war, Japanese defensive strategy abandoned any assumption that the Pacific would slow American advances. Planning documents from early 1945 focus on homeland defense, on preparing for invasion, on accepting that American forces could reach Japan itself. The ocean had failed as a moat. The great defensive perimeter had been not just breached, but rendered meaningless by an enemy that treated thousands of miles of water as a highway to be driven rather than a barrier to be respected. The human cost of this transformation was borne by Japanese sailors and soldiers stationed on islands that became isolated as American forces bypassed them. Places like Truk, Rabaul, and dozens of smaller garrisons found themselves cut off, no longer receiving supplies, watching American ships steam past on routes that should not have existed. These men starved slowly, their combat capability eroded not by direct assault, but by the simple fact that the logistics network supporting them had been destroyed. The ocean that was supposed to protect them had become a prison. For American planners, the success of the fleet train validated a massive investment in auxiliary vessels and underway replenishment capability. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific operations, wrote in a 1945 assessment, "The development of mobile logistics has fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of Pacific warfare. Distance is no longer a meaningful defensive advantage. Any position within range of our carrier aircraft can be struck and held under continuous pressure. The enemy's defensive perimeter exists only on maps." The statistics of American logistics operations in the Pacific are staggering in their scale. In support of the Okinawa invasion in 1945, the logistics fleet delivered more than 750,000 tons of supplies, transported 548,000 troops, and pumped millions of gallons of fuel to combat ships without those ships ever entering port. The operation sustained combat operations for 82 days of continuous fighting, all supplied from floating bases and underway replenishment. This was industrial warfare applied to naval operations with a thoroughness that made geography subordinate to engineering. The fuel hose, stretching across the gap between tanker and warship, carried more than petroleum. It carried the accumulated expertise of American industrial planning, the willingness to invest in unglamorous support systems, the understanding that victory in modern war required solving logistical problems as much as tactical ones. Each successful replenishment operation was a mile gained, a day extended, an assumption of Japanese planning invalidated. The Japanese had claimed the Pacific was their ocean, secured by distance and island bases.
They had built a strategy on the assumption that America could not project power across such vast waters, could not sustain operations thousands of miles from home ports, could not overcome the tyranny of geography. They had, in essence, bet their empire on the ocean being impassable. America had called that bet and proven it false. Not through superior ships alone, though American ships were often superior. Not through better admirals alone, though American admirals learned and adapted. But through a revolution in logistics that treated the ocean as engineers treat obstacles, as problems to be solved through systematic application of resources and ingenuity.
When the war ended in August 1945, American ships filled harbors across the Pacific, Manila, Tokyo Bay, dozens of anchorages that had been Japanese just months or years before. The fleet train that had made this possible was already planning for peacetime conversion, for the return of millions of soldiers across the ocean highways that had carried them to war. The infrastructure of conquest would become the infrastructure of peace, but the capability remained, the ability to move vast quantities of men and material across oceanic distances, to turn the Pacific from barrier into highway. In a naval museum in Pearl Harbor, there rests a section of fuel hose from a fleet oiler, preserved as a reminder of unglamorous necessity. The placard notes that this particular hose transferred fuel to carriers during the raids on the Japanese home islands in 1945, that it was part of a logistics system that enabled operations previously thought impossible. Visitors walk past it usually, drawn to more dramatic exhibits, the guns of battleships, the aircraft of carrier squadrons. But that hose, unimpressive in appearance, represents something more profound than any weapon. It represents the transformation of geography from absolute constraint to engineering problem. It represents the willingness to invest in systems that enable rather than destroy, that support rather than strike. It represents a fundamental truth about industrial warfare, that victory belongs not just to those with the best weapons, but to those who can maintain those weapons, supply those weapons, sustain operations long enough for those weapons to achieve their purpose. The Japanese had understood that the Pacific was vast. They had counted on that vastness to protect them. What they had not understood was that vastness is relative, that distance can be conquered not just by going faster, but by going continuously, that barriers exist only until someone develops the tools to cross them. The American answer to the Pacific's vast distances was not to accept them, but to build around them, to create a mobile logistics infrastructure so comprehensive that the ocean became not an obstacle, but a medium, not a moat, but a highway. The fleet train was not glamorous. It did not win headlines. Its ships did not sink enemy carriers or bombard enemy positions. But without those unglamorous tankers and cargo ships, without those patient crews manning the refueling stations and ammunition transfers, the carriers and battleships would have been ornaments, beautiful and useless, unable to reach the enemy or sustain the fight once they arrived. The ocean remembers. In the depths where light fails, there rest the hulls of Japanese ships sunk, trying to supply isolated garrisons, trying to maintain a logistics network that could not adapt to mobile warfare. On the surface, where sun glints off blue water, there steam the descendants of those fleet train vessels, modern replenishment ships still practicing the art of underway refueling, still maintaining the capability to project power across oceanic distances.